Christmas on Jane Street, Chapter 5, The Long Night. I pulled out my trusty pocket watch and checked the time. I'd wait up for her. Surely she'd be back by 9:30 or 10 at the latest. I smiled to myself, thinking about how the sequence of events would play out. Ellie would come back from her adventure telling me what had happened. She'd be so full of the experience that it would override any other emotion, namely having felt hurt or slighted by me. She was still enough of a kid to want to tell me all immediately. I noticed in life that once someone tells his or her story and you really listen, your differences fade away. It's just like getting stone-faced customers to laugh. I resolved then and there to cast aside all my reservations and enter into the spirit of the occasion. Usually when Ellie told me about an adventure, her excitement would get me going too. She'd start telling me what happened and I'd interrupt with questions. Tonight I'd ask, where did you sit? What did you think of the show? Or Lincoln Center? And the outfit? Was it alone? Do you have to go out and spend all your money on it? She'd generally answer my questions, then jump around from place to place, getting confused and backtracking to explain this or that. Finally, I'd suggest she start over and tell me what happened right from the beginning. Then I'd impose a rule on myself, no questions or interruptions until she finished. This time, it would just be the two of us. With Patty and the boys in bed, I'd have Ellie's undivided attention and she'd have mine. Maybe if she were still going strong, I'd suggest we go to the all-night coffee shop around the corner and make it an occasion. We'd order dessert or herbal tea and just be together. I might even say something self-deprecating about my behavior that would make her realize I was sorry for not having signed on to the spirit of her adventure early on, that I was concerned I'd be too harsh. If I checked my pocket watch once that night, I checked it 1,000 times. I pulled it over every 5 minutes, watching the slow creep of the dial. I did this even more frequently after 10 o'clock when our tree business died. It was cold and windy when our tree, and every so often I'd step into the camper and make myself some hot tea to warm up. But when the family turned in, I'd stayed outside longer than usual, sweeping needles and pacing up and down the sidewalks to keep moving. It was approaching midnight, and still there were no signs of Ellie. The cordless phone, which I'd slipped into my jacket pocket, hadn't rung all evening. What if something had happened to her? My mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. Maybe she'd been kidnapped. Since the Abbotts lived just one block above us on 8th Avenue, which ran out of way uptown, the cabbie might have left them on their corner. Could Ellie have told Ann Abbott that she just walked the block from Emma's to our camper by herself? Could Ann have allowed that? Might something dreadful have happened to her en route or elsewhere? Ellie's confident tone was so impressive that adults often forgot how young she still was. As I flashed on images of my daughter in trouble, a victim of a random shooting, in the clutches of some pervert, or hung on or hurt or wounded along the side of the road, sweat pouring from my body. Not long before, I'd read about a child who was standing in a street corner and had been hit and killed by a city bus that ran up the curve. I felt powerless, knowing that if she were in trouble, there was nothing I could do to help. Then I remembered. Ellie had gone into the camper to speak to Patty before she left. Probably she'd asked permission to spend the night with Emma, and Patty had failed to mention it to me. One of the ironies of this season is that Patty and I are both so busy, some days we pass before we have any private time with each other. It was logical that since things had been so tense between us, Ellie would have turned to Patty instead of me. So I did something unprecedented. I delayed counting the day's sales total. I'd do it the next day. I stripped down to my long thermal underwear and climbed into bed. I reached over and touched my wife's long brown hair spread out like a fan above her head on the pillow. Sleeping soundly, Patty rolled over and opened an eye. Did Ellie ask to spend the night with Emma? I asked. She didn't even hear me the first time, so I repeated myself. She didn't say anything about it to me, Patty said. Then both her eyes opened and she seemed to come fully awake. Isn't she here now? What time is it? I answered her questions and speculated that she must have gone to Emma's. Patty thought for a moment. I'm sure you're right. Ellie's got to be at Emma's. Maybe they got in so late that they didn't want to disturb us, or maybe they aren't back yet. Patty turned back on her side and mumbled something about hoping Ellie had a great time. With that, she shut her eyes and slipped back into sleep. I had brought with me into our bed the cordless phone, which I laid alongside the pillow. I held it to my ear and pushed the on button just to be sure it was working. I slept fitfully that night. I kept waking to check my pocket watch and my daughter's bunk as if she might have magically reappeared, but all I saw was Zippy, looking there forlorn with his monkey arm dangling off the side of Ellie's bed. By the wee hours, it should have been obvious that she wasn't coming home that night, but that didn't stop me from looking. More than once I considered calling the Abbott house despite the lateness of the hour, but my better judgment prevailed. I woke up for a good just after 5 that morning, early for me. Since Patty and the boys were trying to sleep, I made an effort to dress quietly. But the camper is so small that it's hard for anyone to do anything without anyone sharing in their experience. I wanted hot tea, but the kettle would start whistling louder than the most persistent alarm clock. Instead, I twisted the cap off the bottle of water and sat it on the bench seat below Ellie's bunk, thinking. Zippy's arm, dangling down from above, touched my head. As I sipped, I could hear New York City waking up. Though the early morning traffic hasn't yet started its rumble, the garbage men had already come and gone, and the delivery trucks were going strong, unloading the many goods needed to keep the city running. Diesel-fueled trucks were throwing off bundles of New York Times and Daily News newspapers, which dropped with a loud thuds onto the sidewalk in front of the 3 delis within hearing distance. Delivery men offloading newspapers, soft drinks, bread, and canned goods paid no attention to the hour of the day, and their halting exchanges were shouted in decibels exceeding their noisy engines. With our camper right in the street, the sounds of the city were amplified for us. As I tallied up the totals from the previous day, I could feel my left eye pulsing its nervous twitch. The totals were good, but the twitch was a sign that I was getting tight and tense and needed to get out and stretch. I stepped outside into the pitch-black world around me, slipping the phone into my jacket pocket. As I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about Ellie. Perhaps I'd been wrong in assuming that if we lived our lives with integrity and made friends with as many of our neighbors as possible, we would live in a kind of safe bubble on Jane Street. I'd always said that you don't build security through locks and barriers, but rather through treating everyone decently with dignity and respect. As I found myself strolling in the direction of Emma's apartment building, the voices of my Vermont friends asking me if I was worried about bringing my family to the city came back to me. At the time, I brushed them off, but if something had happened to Ellie, I'd have only myself to blame for being so cavalier about her safety. I looked up at the apartment, scrutinizing Emma's bedroom window for some sort of answer. I pushed the on button on my portable phone and was about to dial the number I knew by heart. Realizing that it was not yet 5:30, I restrained myself. I would have to wait, but the dark windows didn't offer me a clue. As I had returned to the stand and stayed busy plumping the branches on the trees. I was keeping my eye on the time. At 7 sharp, I dialed the number. The phone was answered after 2 rings by Anne, who sounded groggy. I was calling about Ellie, I said. Is she there? I didn't want to let her know how worried I was, so I consciously tried to tamp down my anxiety. Oh, sure, she answered breezily, but she told me Ellie was still asleep, recovering from her big night on the town. Something in Anne's tone carried a whiff of disapproval, as if she thought I'd been riding Ellie too hard. She didn't offer to wake Ellie, but said she'd send her along home after breakfast. I clicked off the phone, overcome by relief. I wanted to dance a jig. Ellie was safe. Ellie would be back. I returned to my trees. Though I initially felt grateful and relieved that Ellie was very much alive, something began bothering me. I recognized it as irritation. No, the feeling was stronger than that. It was anger. I had spent one whole night agonizing when one simple phone call from her would have put my mind at rest. It wasn't like Ellie not to call. The Ellie I knew was conscientious and considerate. For her to spend the night out and no call, or go out and not think of calling, didn't fit her character. Was she changing so rapidly that I didn't know her anymore? This much was clear. Ellie and I needed to have a serious talk. I had just finished picking up a scattering of trash that had blown into the stand from points unknown during the windy night before. You know, things like advertising circulars, empty styrofoam cups and boxes, and plastic grocery bags, when I spotted her. I watched Ellie step down from the stoop at Emma's building. Although it was a fairly short distance from Emma's Emma's to the stand, she was taking her time, peering into shop windows and even bending down to read a paper in the box. Dressed in her denim jumper and work boots, she looked as plain today as she had elegant the night before, Cinderella after the ball. When she finally arrived at the stand at 9:30, I had known for more than 2 hours that she was safe and sound, but I was steaming. Even though I already knew, and she knew that I knew, I had to ask, "Where have you been?" She rolled her eyes. "You know, I spent the night at Emma's. Anne told me you called this morning at 7. The way she emphasized the word made it clear that she viewed it as quite unreasonable hour. I laughed at my daughter. "And who gave you permission to spend the night out?" "Well, no one, but I figured you'd know where I was." How could I know where you were? "I was worried sick about you all night." She didn't say anything, but one of those looks crossed her face like she really wasn't there. So, to get my point across, I continued. "I am amazed you would think that it was okay to just not come home at night without calling and let your mother and me know where you are. And since when did you spend the night at someone else's place without asking permission?" "Well, I could hardly ask you permission because you weren't even speaking to me yesterday." "I wasn't speaking to you?" I heard myself say. It was happening again. I heard myself shouting. "It seems to me that you weren't speaking to me." "I don't know where or how it's come into your mind, but it appears that you think you're running the show right now." "Daddy, she started as if she were going to come up with some insulting epithet, but thought better of it. "So you had it all worked out before you went to the Nutcracker that you were going to spend the night at Emma's. Do I have this right?" "No, I had decided before. It's just that we got in late. The show was late and dinner was late and just seemed like the thing to do. I really didn't think it through." The way she said it just seemed like the thing to do, got to me. It sounded so casual, like someone else talking. It sounded like her responsibility to us was insignificant, a bother almost. I had no other choice. I was simply going to have to exercise my parental power. This was one of those moments when a father needed to come on strong. "Ellie," I said in a stern tone that set the stage for what was to come, "you spent more time at Emma's this season than you have here, but you've spent all the time that you're going to over there. I need a little help with the stand." Although it might sound harsh, I wasn't about to reward her after she'd been so irresponsible. Ellie needed to learn a lesson. "You're not going to go to Anne Abbott's party tonight." Her eyes widened in disbelief, and then the red flush of anger spread across her face. "Daddy," she said, "I promised them I was going. I promised them I would help them get ready." "You promised me that you were going to help me, and you haven't done that much this year." Her shoulders drooped, and the spark in her eyes went flat. Looking defeated, she just stared at me, saying nothing. "Look, Ellie," I said, "the stand is not just for fun. This is our livelihood." But she wouldn't understand, and the sullen look hardened on her face. "Not only are you not going to the party, you are not going anywhere from the stand without my permission." Then she raised her hand like some sarcastic school kid. Her voice was strangely pitched when she said, "May I go into the camper?" I nodded my head, and she marched into the camper and closed the door behind her. I got busy with customers. Henry was with me and even sold a few candles for his absentee sister. When I had a break in business and ducked my head inside the camper, I was expecting to see her at the table reading or writing or making last-minute Christmas cards. This time, I was prepared for her pouty behavior and one-word answers. But to my surprise, Ellie wasn't there. Neither was Patty and Timmy. When Patty and Timmy returned a while later, I asked Patty where Ellie was. "I thought she was with you," came her reply. Patty looked distracted, and I could sense she was impatient with my ongoing conflict with Ellie. "Maybe she's at Emma's." "She couldn't be," I said. "I grounded her." "Grounded her? Billy, what's going on? You've never grounded Ellie in your life. I've never even heard you use the word grounded. This doesn't happen in our family, Billy. What is going on?" She unclipped her barrette and gathered her hair back into one hand, rearranging it nervously. It was easy to see she wasn't upset with Ellie, but was somehow transferred all the blame to me. I had the feeling that I'd had as a kid when my sisters ganged up on me. I knew I was in the right, but that I had no choice but to hold my ground. For the rest of the day, I was haunted by a strange sense of loss. End of chapter 5.